Most maps leave things out on purpose. Coastlines shift, ink fades, and certain landmarks never make it onto paper at all. I used to believe that absence meant error, or simple oversight. But now, I think some omissions are deliberate. This story began after a storm that rearranged the shore as casually as someone clearing a desk. The fishermen said the sea had climbed higher than they'd ever seen, then retreated with something like reluctance. When the fog lifted 3 days later, the cliffs north of town looked unfamiliar. That was when the lighthouse appeared. The town of Harrow's Reach had always measured itself by its shoreline. The docks creaked in predictable rhythm, and the harbor bell tolled with tides that locals could sense without looking. After the storm, boats returned coated in silt from waters that should have been clear. Lobster traps came up twisted with unfamiliar weeds. The cliffs beyond the last bait shack were rumored to have collapsed in places, though no one had yet walked the full stretch to confirm it. It was early autumn, the season when tourists thinned and the sea turned a colder shade of gray. The morning the lighthouse was first seen, the fog sat low and unmoving. A boy delivering newspapers noticed it from the coastal road and assumed it had always been there. By noon, everyone was certain it had not. I first heard about it from Calder Wynn, who ran the small marine supply store near the pier. He mentioned it quietly, almost absently, while ringing up a spool of measuring tape I didn't need. "Strange thing up on the cliffs," he said, as though he were only talking about the weather. "Looks old." None of us remember it. I laughed at the idea, thinking it was some navigational marker dislodged by the storm. Calder only shrugged and said the Coast Guard had no record of it, and that detail caught my attention more than the structure itself. Records were my trade, in a manner of speaking. I have never been a sailor, but I have spent years charting shorelines that no longer exist. My apartment is stacked with reproduction maps of the eastern seaboard, some dating back to the 1700s. I collect them not for their beauty, though many are beautiful, but for their inaccuracies. Sandbars drawn where none remain, inlets that vanished, speculative islands labeled with hesitant ink. Harrow's Reach has appeared on maps under 3 different names, its harbor drawn slightly off each time. I know the contour of its cliffs in a way that feels almost personal, and I knew with quiet certainty that no lighthouse had ever stood north of the bait shacks. That afternoon, I unrolled every chart I owned that included our coastline. I compared them against satellite prints and maritime survey scans from the last 50 years. The cliffs were consistent in their inconsistency, shifting a few feet here and there with erosion. There were notes about dangerous shoals and wreck sites marked with small crosses, but there was no symbol for a lighthouse, no notation of a beacon. Even temporary lights leave bureaucratic traces. I checked shipping registries and local council archives until dusk settled in through my blinds. The lighthouse was absent from all of them. The next morning, I visited the town archives, which occupy a narrow room above the library. Mrs. Alder, who has guarded the place for 2 decades, allowed me access without question. She seemed relieved that someone else was curious. We leafed through bound town records, maritime permits, and handwritten council minutes. There were entries about storms dating back a century, some far worse than the recent one. None mentioned construction on the northern cliffs. "It's like it stepped out of the fog," Mrs. Alder said softly, then immediately dismissed her own words with a small shake of her head. I wrote down the phrase anyway. In the corner of the archive room, beneath a window that overlooked the harbor, stood a locked glass case. It held a handful of donated artifacts, a rusted sextant, a captain's coat, and several old journals. I had skimmed them before, in idle moments, but that day, one in particular drew my attention. Its spine was cracked, labeled simply, "Maritime Log, 1883. Mrs. Alder unlocked the case and placed it in my hands with careful fingers. The pages smelled faintly of salt and mildew. Most entries were quiet, ordinary accounts of wind direction and cargo. And then, halfway through, a line caught my eye. It was written in a firmer hand than the surrounding notes. Sighted light beyond charted edge, calls ships toward forgotten water. The date beside it was October 17th, 1883. There were no coordinates listed, only a small sketch in the margin. The sketch resembled a tower perched on a narrow cliff, drawn with surprising precision. I felt a tightening in my chest that I could not easily explain. The phrase beyond charted edge lingered with me. Harrow's Reach had been charted extensively by that year. I asked Mrs. Alder if any lighthouse had been proposed in the 1880s, and she consulted a ledger of federal correspondences before gently shaking her head. The nearest official beacon, she said, was miles to the south, built decades earlier and still operational. The journal's author, a merchant captain named Elias Rowe, had made no further mention of the sighting. His next entry spoke only of calm seas and an uneventful return to port. It was as though the light had not warranted elaboration, or as though it had been understood. I photographed the page and returned the journal to its case. Outside, the fog had thickened again. By late afternoon, I decided to see the structure for myself. The path north of town is not a formal trail, just a stretch of trampled grass leading toward the cliffs. The air smelled of brine and something metallic left behind by the storm. Gulls circled lower than usual, their calls muted in the heavy mist. I passed the last of the fishing shacks and continued along the uneven ground. With each step, the town sounds faded until only the wind remained. I had expected to glimpse the lighthouse quickly. Instead, the fog concealed everything beyond a few yards. When the tower finally emerged, it did so without drama. One moment there was only gray air, and the next, a pale shape resolved into stone. It stood on a jut of cliff that I would have sworn had never existed. The masonry looked weathered, but intact, streaked with salt and lichen. There was no visible path leading directly to its door, only rough grass and rock. The lantern room at the top was dark, its glass faintly clouded. I waited for some sign of recent construction, scaffolding, tire tracks, debris, but found none. The lighthouse appeared as though it had always been there, waiting for the fog to thin. I circled the base slowly, taking notes in a small field journal. The door was made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands. Its handle felt cold and solid when I tested it. The hinges did not creak. I pressed my ear against the surface and heard nothing but wind. For a moment, I considered turning back and returning with someone else, perhaps Calder, or even Mrs. Alder. But the solitude felt necessary, almost required. The lighthouse had no identifying plaque, no builder's mark, no date carved into its stone, only the steady presence of a structure that every record insisted did not exist. I pushed the door open with a measured effort. It swung inward silently, revealing a narrow spiral staircase winding upward into shadow. The air inside smelled faintly of oil and sea salt, not mildew or decay as one might expect. Dust motes drifted in the diffuse light from the small windows at intervals along the wall. I ran my hand along the cold stone, counting each step, listening to my own breathing echo in the empty cylinder. The wind outside thumped against the cliffs, a distant percussion accompanying my ascent. Somewhere above, the lantern glowed dimly, almost imperceptibly warm, though no flame flickered in sight. Halfway up, I noticed small scratches in the stone beside the steps. They were irregular, as though someone had traced initials with a fingernail, or perhaps with a tool long since forgotten. I crouched, leaning in to examine them more closely. The marks were weathered, yet deliberate, and one repeated motif caught my eye: a circle enclosing a tiny cross, drawn with careful symmetry. The symbol reminded me of the sketch in Elias Rowe's journal, the one depicting the lighthouse perched on the cliff, and a shiver ran through me not of fear, but of recognition, as if the building had been anticipating my arrival for decades. Reaching the lantern room, I paused at the doorway. The room was circular, the ceiling domed with a small hatch above. The lantern itself radiated gentle warmth, its brass frame polished and unblemished. I ran my fingers across the glass panels, feeling an odd vibration beneath my touch, subtle, almost like a heartbeat. At the center, a logbook lay open on a small stand, its pages crisp as if recently written. I bent closer, and my eyes widened. The date at the top was tomorrow's, and the signature beneath it was unmistakably my own handwriting. My hand shook slightly as I traced the letters, trying to reconcile the impossible. I backed away and sank onto the cold floor, staring at the logbook. The lighthouse hummed quietly around me, though there was no electrical device anywhere in sight. Then, a faint, rhythmic static began to fill the room. At first, I thought it was only the wind, sneaking through the glass. But slowly, it resolved into something structured, a voice, faint, mechanical, repeating a string of coordinates. I checked the logbook again. The numbers were different from any location I recognized, and every time I looked them up on a chart, they led only to the middle of open water. The coordinates repeated over and over, like a ghost trapped in a loop. And then I realized the sound was coming from the lantern itself, though there was no speaker, no radio, no wires. I explored the room cautiously, checking each corner. There were no exits aside from the staircase I had climbed. The floor was stone, polished by unknown hands, with faint circular stains that suggested someone had set vessels or instruments down here before. Shelves held small, unmarked bottles, dried herbs, and a few metal tools whose purposes I could not determine. I found a brass compass, slightly tarnished, yet its needle wavered erratically, as if disturbed by some unseen force. The air felt heavier with every breath. I noticed that the fog outside had deepened, curling up the cliff face in slow, thick ribbons that obscured the sea entirely. As I studied the logbook further, the entries became stranger. They described events I had not yet experienced. The morning light cutting through mist, gulls circling in impossible formations, the way the wind carries whispers from unseen cliffs. Each line was written in calm, observational language, as though the writer were noting mundane details while quietly holding a deeper truth. One note, almost at the bottom of a page, mentioned a visitor following the path north from the town. My chest tightened. I had walked that path that very morning. The sentences that followed were precise enough to describe my approach to the lighthouse. I closed the book, trying to steady my mind. Nothing in logic or history could explain it. I descended the spiral staircase slowly, stopping every so often, just to listen. The coordinates continued, low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic in the stillness. Outside, the fog was so dense that the cliffs seemed to disappear into it, leaving me with no sense of distance or height. When I reached the ground, I walked around the base again, noticing every crack in the stone, every patch of lichen, every subtle tilt. The lighthouse looked ordinary from the outside, yet every part of it felt purposeful, deliberate, as if the building itself understood that it had been found. I realized then that time here was fluid, stretching and contracting, depending on where I looked and how long I paused. The air around me seemed to hold memory. I returned to town as night fell, moving quietly along streets already deserted. Lanterns flickered weakly in front of shuttered shops, and the water lapped gently against the docks. I could still hear the faint echo of the coordinates in my mind, a pattern I could not shake. Calder noticed my expression as I passed the marine supply store, asking nothing, only raising a brow. I didn't answer. Inside my apartment, I set up maps, charts, and my photographs from the cliffs, trying to find some rational connection. Yet everything aligned and contradicted itself at once. The lighthouse, the journal, the coordinates, they existed and didn't exist simultaneously, like a shadow pressing against reality. Over the next few days, I returned to the lighthouse at different times: dawn, noon, dusk. Each visit revealed subtle changes. Moss appeared in areas previously bare, scratches deepened. The warmth of the lantern fluctuated as if following a hidden schedule. I tried leaving notes and small objects in the lantern room. When I returned, they were moved or gone, never explained. The coordinates repeated, sometimes audible, sometimes only in my memory. I began to wonder if I was meant to understand or merely witness. Every stone, every gust of wind seemed imbued with purpose, yet the purpose remained elusive. I recorded my observations carefully, knowing that documentation might be all I could control. One evening, as I traced the northern path in the fading light, I noticed footprints beside my own. They were fresh, though no one had been on the cliffs when I walked earlier. They did not belong to any human shoe I recognized. They led to the lighthouse door, then vanished. I followed them inside, my boots silent against the stone floor. The logbook remained open, still bearing my signature for tomorrow. I realized that the lighthouse might be recording me as much as I was observing it. The coordinates, the entries, the warmth, they all suggested that something, or someone, was aware of my movements, shaping them subtly, patiently. I spent that night on the cliffs, watching the lighthouse. Fog rolled thickly from the sea, curling around the tower in ghostly spirals. Light from distant vessels reflected faintly on the water, though the sea appeared unnaturally still. Every few minutes, the faint radio signal whispered coordinates into my mind. I wondered if the lighthouse itself was alive in some sense, a sentinel of forgotten waters, recording arrivals and departures across decades. By morning, the fog had not lifted, and the tower stood resolute against a gray sky. I realized that I could not leave this place entirely. It demanded attention, observation, and perhaps something I did not yet comprehend. By the third day, subtle changes became impossible to ignore. The town beyond the cliffs seemed quieter than memory dictated, as if the storm had left more than a rearranged shoreline. Birds circled in patterns I could not track, and the tides arrived with slightly irregular rhythm. Every map I consulted showed the cliffs differently now, their shapes subtly altered, mirroring the lighthouse's presence. I tried to speak of it with Calder, but the words faltered, the sentences dissolving into vague murmurs. He looked at me with a distant kindness, as if humor and worry were intertwined, and offered no judgment. The lighthouse had isolated me, not by walls, but by perception. I found myself returning repeatedly to the lantern room, each time with the sense that the warmth had shifted, just slightly, and the logbook, too, seemed subtly altered. One morning, as the light pressed gently against the glass, I realized that my own reflection was no longer moving in perfect unison with me. It lagged, just a fraction of a second behind. The coordinates grew more persistent after that, entering my dreams as a quiet chant of numbers and directions. I began leaving notebooks of observations beneath the lantern, hoping, perhaps, that some trace of myself might remain there. Even then, I sensed that the lighthouse was not simply a building, but a threshold, a place where memory, time, and geography wove themselves together in a pattern I could not yet read. The cliffs themselves seemed to grow narrower with each visit, the edges more precipitous. Fog hugged the rock face, curling inward in ways that suggested a shape, almost a doorway. Once, while climbing the rough stone path, I glimpsed a faint silhouette in the mist. A figure standing at the very edge, unmoving, then gone when I blinked. I could find no footprints or signs of passage. The air felt electric with anticipation, and my pulse matched it, steady but insistent. I understood that the lighthouse had always been there, and yet had only recently chosen to make itself known to me. By the end of part 2, I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold. The town, the cliffs, the lighthouse, and even my own perception were now entwined in a cycle I could not fully discern. Each step, each observation, revealed more questions than answers. And the logbook, with tomorrow's date written in my hand, insisted that the story had not yet begun, that I was both author and subject of an unfolding mystery. The morning after my last visit, I returned once more to the cliffs, the fog heavier than ever. The lighthouse rose through it like a muted monolith, its walls faintly glistening with moisture. I approached cautiously, noticing that the grass and stone beneath my feet had subtly shifted since yesterday, as if the landscape itself remembered a different configuration and was slowly correcting. The wind carried a whisper that might have been words, or simply the sigh of air moving through narrow crevices. The lantern glowed before I even reached the door, inviting me upward again. My journal, packed carefully in my satchel, felt weightier than usual. Inside, the spiral staircase was unchanged, yet the air was denser, filled with the faint tang of electricity and salt. Each step upward echoed differently, as though the stone had grown attuned to my presence. In the lantern room, the logbook awaited. Its pages had multiplied, several new entries added in handwriting identical to mine, describing observations I had not yet made, the drift of fog, the pattern of gulls, the scent of rain on the cliffs. I ran my fingers over the paper, trying to feel the hand that had written it. The warmth of the lantern pulsed subtly, as if in rhythm with some hidden pulse of the world beyond these walls. The coordinates returned again, louder now, pressing gently against thought rather than air. I wrote them down in my notebook, slowly, carefully, yet when my eyes drifted away, the numbers shifted, rearranging themselves as if they were alive. I checked my maps, my charts, even the satellite imagery I trusted so much. But nothing matched. No island, no stretch of land, no hidden shoal, nothing corresponded to those strange sequences. Still, a quiet certainty settled inside me, as though the lighthouse itself was guiding me, urging me toward a place it wanted me to find. My mind strained against the impossibility of it all, but the curiosity remained, patient, insistent, gnawing softly at the edges of my thoughts. I spent hours walking the cliffs, following the numbers in a pattern only partially logical, pausing to note tiny changes, a rock outcropping slightly altered, moss-forming symbols I hadn't noticed before, and a faint echo of footsteps that never matched my own. The town beyond remained oddly quiet. A dog barked once in the distance, faint and unsure, and a gull dropped silently into the misted waters. It was as though the lighthouse had extended its reach, subtly influencing the surrounding environment, bending perception without breaking it entirely. I felt both observer and observed, the two roles bleeding into one. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the fog parted briefly, revealing the lighthouse's lantern brightly shining despite the absence of dusk. The glow spilled onto the cliff face, revealing a hidden path carved into the stone, previously invisible to me. It was narrow, treacherous, and impossible to follow without losing balance. I traced it slowly, feeling an uneasy thrill at the discovery. The coordinates pulsed stronger in my mind, pointing the way. The tower, in its silent authority, seemed to be offering passage not just through space, but through time or something like it. The realization left a weight in my chest, not fear, but a profound acknowledgement of the unknown. Inside the tower once more, I noticed that the shadows moved independently of the lantern light, stretching along the walls and ceiling as if they were alive. I followed them with my eyes, slowly, and found faint impressions on the stone floor, circular depressions arranged like a constellation. They matched a sketch I had seen in Elias Rowe's journal. I crouched to examine them, feeling as though I was stepping into a dialogue written long before my arrival. I traced the patterns with a fingertip, and the warmth of the lantern intensified, spreading through the room in a manner that was almost comforting, almost sentient. The building seemed to breathe around me. Later, I heard a whisper in my own voice, repeating fragments of the logbook entries I had made. The words were calm, deliberate, and hauntingly familiar. I realized then that the lighthouse did not merely record observations, it anticipated them, mirrored them, and possibly guided them. I tried speaking aloud, asking questions to the shadows, the fog, the room itself. Only silence answered, yet I felt the presence of an unseen listener. My reflection in the glass was once again slightly delayed, lagging by an almost imperceptible fraction of a second. Every element in the lighthouse confirmed a subtle unreality, the kind that makes the familiar strange without warning. As the days passed, the distinction between my own timeline and that suggested in the logbook blurred. Each morning, entries existed before I had written them. Coordinates formed patterns I could not follow linearly. The lighthouse's light never extinguished, yet its warmth waxed and waned with no discernible reason. I began to dream of the cliffs in impossible configurations, the lighthouse stretching taller or shorter depending on the angle, the fog shaping itself into symbols that vanished when I blinked. I understood that the building was not bound by ordinary time, and that it held a domain I could only partially perceive. One morning, I climbed the cliffs and saw a ship far beyond the horizon, its lights blinking in a rhythm that mimicked the coordinates I had been hearing. No one else in the town noticed it. The fog thickened, and when I returned to the lighthouse, the spiral staircase seemed longer than before, the walls narrower. I realized that I was moving through something that was at once the present and something else entirely past, future, or a place outside time itself. Each step brought awareness without comprehension, curiosity tempered by a persistent unease. The lighthouse, in its patient silence, held all answers, and none at all. On the final night, I sat in the lantern room with the logbook open before me. The pages now contained a detailed account of every step I had taken, every hesitation, every glance written in my own hand. The warmth of the lantern pulsed gently, synchronizing with the rhythm of my breath. Outside, the fog shifted, as if alive, curling into forms that suggested faces, pathways, and letters I could not read. I felt that I had become part of a continuum, observer, subject, and perhaps author simultaneously. The coordinates whispered one last sequence, fading slowly into the silence of the night. I closed my eyes, listening, knowing that the trail would continue even after I left. The next morning, the lighthouse appeared empty, still and ordinary to anyone who might look from the cliffs. I returned to town with my notes, photographs, and journals, but the structure itself refused to explain. It waited silently, as it always had, for the next set of eyes. Some places are meant to be found only once. Some lights call, and no one ever fully answers.